Welcome back to Viewpoint. Well, what is the state of the economy and are we overtaxed? And what should we expect in the upcoming federal budget? I'm joined now from Melbourne by Peter Anderson, who's the Chief Executive of the Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thanks for joining us, Peter.
Yes, hello, Chris.
Look, Peter, we hear all the time that we'd like to see more bipartisanship in politics. Well, this week we got a bipartisan broken promise and a bipartisan new levy. Was that the fiscally lazy option from our politicians?
Well, the National Disability Insurance Scheme is good social policy. There certainly was a need to improve our social compact with an area that had been neglected, our disabled. But unfortunately, what this week showed is that our federal finances are in such poor repair that necessary social infrastructure like that could not be accommodated inside a $340 billion existing tax take. And that's very disappointing.
But up until last week, both the government and the opposition were saying that they could fund this program out of existing budget revenue, remembering, of course, that this program will take 4 or 5 years to roll out, and they were looking into the out years and suggesting that they'll be okay. They can fund it without a levy. Why the change of heart?
Well, it should have been funded from within existing revenue. That would have required government to undertake a root and branch review of its expenditure, as we expect governments to do. The government a week ago softened us all up to expect an increased tax. I don't think that was justified, because the revenues the government is going to receive this year from existing taxes are $340 billion, which is about $20 billion more than last year. So the idea that the government has had a crash of revenue, has a crisis in revenue, simply is not fair to taxpayers. What's happened is the government has not been prepared to put in place the type of discipline inside its spending to allow these social priorities like the Disability Insurance Scheme to be funded in the ordinary way through our regular budget.
I want to come back to that revenue issue in a moment, but first I just want to go to what this does to the tax scales. And with the 0.5% increase in the Medicare levy, you're now looking at, say, people who are earning $80,000 or more paying 39 cents in the dollar. People on the top scale, $180,000 or more a year, paying 47 cents in the dollar. Is this too much? Does this put Australia at a competitive disadvantage?
There's no doubt that Australia needs to be competitive, not just in terms of income taxes, but our tax system generally. We want to be a country that's competitive in Asia. We've just seen our Australian dollar move to a structurally high level that has put tremendous competitive pressure on our industries. And as a result of that, we've also imposed on ourselves costs like the carbon tax, which have been a known goal on our competitiveness. So there's no doubt that our government needs to move in the opposite direction. That is, not to increase business taxes or personal income taxes, but to take tax pressure off the doing of business so we can be competitive. You tax industry, you tax households, and you actually weaken the economy.
You mentioned before that, of course, tax revenues are still growing for the government. The point is that they haven't gone backwards. They just haven't grown by quite as much as the government had forecast. They're growing this year at about 7%, apparently. Now, Tony Abbott has been reported today as suggesting that he wants the government's, the taxation share of the economy, if you like, to shrink even further. And here's what the Prime Minister said in response to that.
What would he have to cut to reduce it by a percentage point? Well, everything we spend on schools, almost everything we spend in family tax benefits. He'd have to take an axe to payments on childcare, to carers, to students. Now, if that's what the Leader of the Opposition wants to do, he needs to detail how much it would cost every family in Australia.
Well, Peter Anderson, the Prime Minister's half right there, isn't she? If we wanted to reduce the amount of taxation as a share of the gross domestic product now, there would have to be savage cuts. But if governments, Labor or Liberal, could just hold the line on the growth of government, wouldn't the taxation share decline as a percentage of the economy as the economy grew? Isn't that really what governments should be looking to do, just restrain themselves?
Well, it's certainly not an all or nothing issue. There is plenty of activity by government which costs the taxpayer a lot of money, which does not go to essential services like schools, education, health, the important things the government needs to do. You can start by just reducing the level of regulation on the business community, and you therefore reduce the number of government officials and bureaucrats who need to administer that regulation. You can start by reducing the number of government departments, and as a result you reduce the pressure on the taxpayer without actually reducing the services.
But
there's plenty of work that can be done to reduce the cost pressure of government if you have the will to do so.
But the government is talking about restraint. The opposition is talking about restraint. We're in this extended election campaign where everybody's talking about the fact that they should restrain themselves and that the budget is fragile, obviously heading for another large deficit. Yet we've got promises of tens of billions of dollars of new spending. I mean, are we living in a fantasy land here, and do we need to get an honest answer, a reckoning from obviously the government initially in this budget, but also from the opposition before the election?
Well, one of the first things that should be done is there should be a commission of audit into the state of the budget and the level of Commonwealth spending.
Well, the opposition's already promising to do that if they win. Are you saying the government should do that now?
Absolutely. We have not had a root and branch review of Commonwealth spending in Australia for nearly 20 years. We need to do that because over that period of time the size of government has increased, the level of duplication with our state and territory governments has increased, and as a result the taxpayer has had an increase in their tax burden. We as a country need to become much more competitive in terms of tax rates. We need to be a country that does not tax employment as heavily as we do. If you tax the Australian household and the Australian business community as heavily as we do, we end up weakening our economy. And as Asian economies have industrialised, the competitive pressure has become greater, and the urgency for us to actually make sure that we don't put unnecessary tax imposts on our own economy without being able to afford it is vital.
Well, if you're looking for cuts in government expenditure, can you detail what you'd get rid of, what you'd like to see governments get rid of? For instance, the school kids bonus, family tax benefit B, the baby bonus. A lot of these have been identified by think tanks and the like as middle class welfare we should get rid of.
Well, there are some of those programs which I think should be questioned, like the baby bonus, because you have to ask the question whether, given that we now have a parental leave scheme that is funded, whether we also need a baby bonus scheme. But the broader point is that it's actually not the job of the business community to go through those government programs, program by program. Politicians put their hand up to be in government. Politicians put their hand up to actually take the privilege of responsibly using the taxpayers' dollars and exercising the taxing power. It's their job, having set up these programs, to ensure that they're acting responsibly in administering them and to get rid of them if they're not actually serving their purpose or if other circumstances have rendered them redundant. I think that's the hard work of government, but it needs to be done.
I think the point is that the politicians from both major parties talk the talk all right, but we don't see them walk the walk on this. I mean, for instance, we were supposed to be looking at a surplus in a couple of weeks, but obviously the government has not been able to deliver it.
Well, there's deep frustration, Chris, in the business community because we have been promised over the past couple of years a number of forms of tax relief that have not been delivered. Just 12 months ago, the government was saying that in the budget last year there would be a reduction in company tax. We looked at the budget papers on the day, and lo and behold, that company tax promise was completely trashed. We were told that the mining tax would fund higher superannuation levies, and yet on the 1st of July this year, all Australian businesses, including the ignored small and medium businesses of this country, are going to be paying a higher superannuation levy out of their own payroll, not as a result of any action the government's taken to defray the cost.
Exactly. And you've also got an opposition leader who's running an Axe the Mining Tax and Axe the Carbon Tax campaign, but he's promising yet another tax. He's promising on business and a 1.5% levy to fund his paid parental, an extra generous paid parental leave scheme. Would you like to see him drop that, especially given the fact that we're now heading for another deficit?
Well, yes, we would. And when this was first announced a couple of years ago, we indicated that we did not think that it was a necessary scheme for Australia, given that the existing parental leave scheme more than adequately meets international standards and international norms.
So do you think that Tony Abbott is likely to drop that? We're looking at the budget next week and he'll give his budget in reply speech. Do you think Tony Abbott might get rid of that policy because it involves yet another impost on business?
Well, I'd like to hope that he does, because there are good reasons for doing so, but he has made it a signature policy of the opposition, and so if he is going to proceed with that policy, then there needs to be a root and branch review of Commonwealth spending so that the funding of that policy can be found from within the general budget rather than through an additional levy or an additional impost. Chris, the small and medium businesses of Australia have been too heavily taxed already, and large businesses being taxed ends up flowing some of those costs back down to small and medium businesses. So we just need to be very careful about what our priorities are. Budgets are about priorities, and the one area of the Australian business community that has been ignored for too long in terms of budget settings are the small and medium businesses of Australia, and whether that's through direct costs like the superannuation levy, or whether it's through paid parental leave schemes that end up flowing costs down the supply chain, they actually need cost pressure taken off them, because they are 2 million Australians that employ 7 million people, and that's too big to ignore.
Peter Anderson, thanks very much for joining us from Melbourne tonight.
Good, thank you, Chris.